Hello and welcome back to Earthbeat Visions, a history of the future sound of London. Today we'll be looking exclusively at the Black ISDN. Release date 5th of December 94. In 2021 there was a discussion on the FSOL board about albums, their contents and how they're released, and it fed into something I'd noticed, the lack of conventional album releases in the FSOL catalogue between 2015 and 2021. And yet, here, in 1994, is a perfect example of them releasing an album in an unconventional manner. ISDN is a strange record. It's not quite a live album, yet it was marketed largely as one. It was released as a limited edition of 30,000 copies internationally, a tiny number in 1994, and then given a large-scale reissue the following year. It came out about 6 months after their previous album. The album fans were expecting to follow Lifeforms was a second amorphous androgynous album called Environments, as advertised on the Lifeforms sleeve. There's been much speculation about how much of that album became ISDN, from the plain black cover to the inclusion of a study of 6 guitars, a track that first appeared on a Virgin compilation as an amorphous androgynous track listed as being taken from the forthcoming amorphous androgynous album Environments. In summer 1994, Astralworks advertised both Environments and an Eggshell single as forthcoming. However, given the speed the band have always worked at, it's perhaps unsurprising that by the autumn they had a wealth of new material, largely showcasing a very new sound, and so it seems the older releases were scrapped to make way for these new tracks. The live nature of the album is intriguing. The 3D Headspace tour via ISDN cables was groundbreaking. It wasn't until 2017 that the band received 2 Guinness World Records stating the fact, but it's always been understood that they were the first group to conduct a live tour from their studio. Indeed, it wasn't until the widespread availability of broadband internet in the 2000s that this kind of thing even began to become commonplace. Orbital conducted a brief show to Radio 1 in 95, but ISDN as a live music medium never really took off and remained the playground of Brian and Garry through to 97. It was a unique idea and one the press were genuinely keen on. Electronic music often being hard to market, anything of potential novelty value was leapt upon, and so it's unsurprising that an album was compiled of tracks from the transmissions and given the name ISDN, that name coming very late in the day, almost interfering with release dates. That said, without the fact being pushed in the title and credits, listeners wouldn't be any the wiser. Live transmissions frequently featured these same arrangements of tracks, elements bolted together to play out while the band sorted out the next lot of samples, meaning the tracks on display here don't sound live. There's no scrappiness, no errors, no improvised jamming. And as there's no crowd noise and the tracks were recorded in the studio, they are, for all intents and purposes, studio tracks. It sounds exactly like a studio album and was marketed as a live album. The 3D Headspace tour of May and June 94 largely consisted of Lifeforms adjacent material, and only Dirty Shadows and elements of Tired come from that tour. A second tour later in the year is responsible for the bulk of the material, especially the VPRO and New York transmissions. Indeed, those 2 shows themselves feel like alternate takes on the album. According to an All-Star News article from 1996, 10 US shows were broadcast in November 94, although no evidence of these can be found elsewhere. If the Podroom ever does get ported over to Mixcloud one day, maybe we'll find out. As it is, the only known shows from late 94 are the aforementioned VPRO and New York transmissions, as well as one purported to be played on Kiss FM. These 3 broadcasts have very different feels to them. Unlike the Lifeforms tour, which was very much variations on a theme, these later transmissions showcase different sides of the 94 material. New York's largely ambient, environment-heavy soundscapes, VPRO's dark, oppressive beats, and Kiss FM's brighter melodic electronica. The latter largely ended up missing from the album, with the bulk of the record alternating between hip-hop-inspired, percussion-heavy tracks and spooky ambience. Garry explained the new, heavier direction in a 1994 telephone interview.
By which I think we're actually getting back into beats, but it's a kind of a new kind of beat, not based on dancing. It's a very intricate listening type beat that kind of stimulates your mind, I suppose, rather than your feet.
And it's true there's very little danceable on ISDN. Some of it must have come to a shock to fans expecting an album released so soon after Lifeforms to be stylistically similar, and were faced with acoustic drum loops, electric guitar chords, imposing tracks like Slider, and track titles like Just a Fucking Idiot. It was at least a semi-conscious move away from the increasingly safe ambient scene.
I think people become very scared about music and mechanisms moving on because it threatens their livings, you know. So in terms of that, I think that's probably happening with ambient as well. So of course we're against that.
On the more ambient side of the album, there are still a few tracks that would fit nicely alongside Lifeforms, Dirty Shadows, and Tired of course, but also Egypt and You're Creeping Me Out. On the other hand, It's My Mind That Works, Just a Fucking Idiot, and Eyes Pop, Skin Explodes, Everybody Dead contain the same claustrophobic bleakness of the heavier tracks and feel very much of a different era indeed. The most bizarre inclusion is Hot Knives, a track which features a lead vocal by Garry. It's one of the most unexpected moments in the band's catalogue and is a world away from the exotic ambience they were releasing mere months earlier. When Garry referred to new electronic music as being quite a harsh thing to Mixmag in late '93, it feels like a foreshadowing. Something else that sets the album apart from previous releases is the artwork. With Boogie's bold graphics normally adorning the band's covers, the plain black cover feels like a very bold statement. Describing the release process on the old EBV site, Garry described the album's limited edition status as being at least partially inspired by the Beatles' 1968 self-titled album generally referred to as the White Album. The plain embossed sleeve's similarity to that album may be a coincidence, but it's likely that it was at least in the back of their minds when deciding on a cover. Boogie's work gets centre stage inside, however, with the card sleeve opening to a 3-page spread featuring an utterly surreal landscape, starring bizarrely mutated versions of the band's faces. Stylistically not dissimilar to the visuals on the Lifeforms VHS, it depicts a stream running through a queasy green-gold rock-laden landscape, a single tree on the riverbank, numerous orbs floating by. Brian is on the left, his head protruding upwards in 3 spikes, bizarrely resembling a human tooth. Garry is on the right, his head pulled back off the screen, elevated on some kind of stand and looking a bit like a sphinx. At least that's how I always saw them. It's possibly the weirdest image in the whole FSOL catalogue. The extreme use of computer manipulation makes it feel oddly less subtle than earlier work, and it probably hasn't dated as well as its gatefold equivalent in Lifeforms, but it's an undeniably striking and memorable image. The disc comes in a sleeve with a much more understated image of cracked earth on one side and a wireframe image on the other. The credits appear underneath one of Garry's texts, musing on the reasons behind the ISDN tour format, the first of these stories to be published. There's also an infographic broadly explaining how the music travelled from sampler to home radio, and information about the email FSOL sent to Boogie with the text in. Amazingly, it's dated 17th of October 94, only 6 weeks before the album was released. In an era where manufacturing lead times for vinyl can be anything up to 12 months, the idea of an artwork for a big release only being put together a few weeks before the record hit the shops is staggering. The EBV logo sits alongside the 1970s Virgin logo on the rear sleeve. The CD designs match those of the Lifeforms era, while the LP labels feature the 70s Virgin logo again. Both CD and LP feature the same sleeve design, a fold-out card sleeve, and the disc packaged in a second cardboard inner. It's a very unusual design for an era where most albums exclusively came in jewel cases. Astonishingly, this means the whole 75-minute album is crammed into a single piece of vinyl, meaning it's an incredibly quiet pressing. No cassette edition was released. Boogie isn't credited at all, and Brian and Garry's names are similarly missing from the liner notes. Some space is given over to listing which broadcast the tracks were performed on, and in usual FSOL style, there are numerous errors. A study of 6 guitars and an end of sorts are both listed as having come from the Essential Mix broadcast, which featured neither. Their only known broadcasts are on the VPRO and Kiss FM transmissions respectively. Egypt and Hot Knives are listed as being VPRO performances, despite only being on the Kiss FM show. Ice Pop, Skin Explodes, Everybody Dead is another Kiss FM track rather than New York, and although listed as being a New York track, that is in fact the only known transmission from the entire year not to feature at least one section of Tired. Numerous tracks are given no transmission date, instead being given sample credits instead. A John Williams bass loop on both Smokin' Japanese Babe and Are They Fighting Us, The Far Out Son of Lung and the Ramblings of Madman featuring bizarrely Baseballs by Philip Pinn, and guitar textures by Robert Fripp appearing on tracks labelled with a % symbol. There are no tracks labelled with a % symbol. Amusingly, some of these credits and dates change on the 1995 reissue of the album. For its release, the band were hoping to make a grandiose statement and limit the release to 100,000 numbered copies, much in the vein of the Beatles. However, this went against standard music industry practice of limited editions being runs of 10,000 at the time. If that figure seems high today, an era where 1,000 albums can get you a charting position, they were staggeringly low for the time. As Garry questioned, why, with Lifeforms selling well in excess of 100,000 copies, should we wish to return to this shrivelled state of ambition? A compromise was made. 10,000 copies for the UK, 10,000 for the US, just UK versions with an Astralwerks sticker on the front, and 10,000 for the rest of the world. They sold out almost immediately, the album limping to number 62 in the 1994 Christmas charts, hampered by its limited copies. Interestingly, Garry's story states a further 70,000 were later made at the start of '95, although there appears to be no evidence of this anywhere. Even more interestingly, he blames this second release as the reason ISDN 2 never happened. Were the band planning to release a second album of material from the translations? And was this scrapped because of the repress, or more likely the repackaged version released the following summer? It would certainly explain the huge amount of ISDN era material on the From the Archives releases. I have a lot of thoughts about ISDN, but by the time I bought a copy of the black version, I'd been living with the 1995 white reissue for 4 years, and so I'll keep them to the entry for that version. Just a fucking idiot. Could you leave the lights alone, please? Stop flashing the fucking lights is one of those oft-quoted FSOL samples and opens ISDN. As I mentioned in the previous video, the source remains unknown, although the rumour that it is Bernard Sumner from either a Joy Division or early New Order bootleg has been disproven, and Brian says he will not reveal the name of the band. Garry later went on to suggest that it was in fact the band talking as a way to show they were there to the listeners at the kitchen in New York, which probably gives as good an idea as anything as to how big a pinch of salt FSOL interviews should be taken with. The track sets out the tone of the album as soon as it picks up. This is no Lifeform sequel. The kick drum, or at least the typically unidentifiable sample that acts as a kick drum, is punchy and growly. The track continues building with bizarre percussive sounds and squelchy synths until the first really melodic element appears after the 2-minute mark, a deeply unsettling synth pad. It's a truly paranoid sounding piece of music, leaving listeners with no doubt that the tone of this album will match the pitch black of the album's cover. A melancholic synth melody pops up at the halfway point and near the end, but does little to lighten the mood. The totally unconventional use of sounds throughout the entire track, probably largely taken from sci-fi movie sound effects, lead to a properly alien feel throughout. A number of the sounds reappear on It's My Mind That Works later on the album. The title, another very unlifeforms aspect of the track, is yet another bit of self-deprecation from the band and their seemingly low opinions of each other and themselves. The album lists the track as being taken from the VPRO performance on the 9th of September. Far Out Son of Lung and the Ramblings of a Madman, also known as Ramblings of a Madman.
Everybody online looking good.
There are some iconic spoken samples on ISDN. The one that opens the Far Out Son of Lung has possibly become more associated with FSOL than Aliens, the film it comes from. It follows a kick in the face of an intro and leads into a chunky breakbeat that continues the musical voyage further from the shores of Lifeforms. With electric guitar power chords, muted trumpet improvisation and growling bass, the track could almost be performed by a live band rather than an electronic music duo. There are some particularly wobbly synth lines swirling around over the top of things, but for the most part it's all sample based, real instruments and layers of the group's bizarre sounds. We don't take samples whole and put them straight in, Garry told Select in '92. We really fuck around with them, we put them through processes, turn them backwards. It's a constant evolution. This is maybe the key approach during the ISDN era, a period where the band's music felt furthest away from typical electronica. Or perhaps Brian's follow-up line from the same interview sums it up best. FSOL is music for spliff-heads, not E-heads. And it's true, this is absolutely stoner-friendly, psychedelic, downright weird music. The feel of the track suits the ISDN format too, less tightly structured than earlier pieces with more of a sprawling feel. If it hadn't been used on either an unreleased earlier FSOL track, Across the Rivers, one could almost imagine the trumpet solo was improvised especially for Far Out Son. The title is one of the band's boldest, or daftest depending on your perspective. Far Out Son of Lung was originally used as an alias to deliver the track, titled Ramblings of a Madman, on an intentionally misleading release. Of course, the fact that initialised Far Out Son of Lung reads FSOL gave the game away somewhat. The track that follows it on that 12-inch Z-Box is a solo Brian track from the 80s, originally known as Ear Out and or TV Dinner Part 1, and is retained in part to form the bizarre growling outro section. The CD edition of the black version of ISDN indexes this section at the start of Appendage. For the general release edition of ISDN, the track was released as a standard promotional single. Despite the comparatively fast tempo, it's not an obvious single choice until placed alongside just about everything else on this staggeringly uncommercial album. The single version includes an extended outro. A music video exists made for the Far Out Son of Lung VHS. No transmission date is given in the liner notes of ISDN, instead giving credit to band alias Philip Pinn for Baseballs. No idea. The first known broadcast of the track is the VPRO transmission on the 9th of September. Appendage. Even a heavy-going album like ISDN needs to take a break, and this 2-minute ambient piece fits that bill. A single major chord sample runs throughout the piece, on top of which the band's sample library is liberally sprinkled. Backwards guitar notes, opening manhole covers, clanging metal, a brief quiet reverse tambourine loop, whistling noises, a backwards sample of a voice announcing "We love our children," the ever-present wordless female vocals. Remarkably, the use of a major chord manages to make these sound somewhat friendly rather than sinister, as they might well do in another context. It retains the slightly claustrophobic feel of its parent album, but nevertheless acts as a brief moment of brightness. The CD indexing on the two different versions of the album places the intro and outro environments in different places. The black edition includes the Z-Box sampling outro of The Far Out Son of Lung, while the white edition includes the Not Bad for a Human alien sample at the end. The track is credited as being taken from the New York transmission. A slightly longer version of the track can be heard on the earlier VPRO broadcast. Slider. The two CD editions of ISDN index Slider differently. The black edition starts with the aliens sampling Not Bad for a Human environment, the white starting on the first kick of the track. I prefer the latter. This is a track that punches you in the face, and the intro doesn't add to that effect. Put simply, Slider is a beast. Huge slabs of percussion, densely layered, are the main focus. A distorted 303 line takes up the melodic duties, while Eastern-sounding female vocals and flutes wail from the mist. Bass synth notes shudder through the mix at intervals. It's the sound of a post-apocalyptic city barely gripping to some semblance of order as people swarm through its smog-infested streets. I absolutely hated it at first. Where were the open landscapes and beautiful melodies of life forms and dead cities? But it's really grown on me over the years and has become one of my favourite 90s tracks. Those 303 squelches just after the 5-minute mark are a real highlight. The CD versions and black vinyl edition of ISDN feature the first extended environment during the outro, a wonderful creepy piece with growling, gurgling organic noises, disembodied voices and the tolling of a church bell. Sadly, this environment is missing entirely from the white 2LP edition of the album. The track was earmarked as a potential second single, with a radio edit even being made, and unheard until Electric Brainstorm's 11, and a catalogue number set aside via CDT 1650. One way or another, a full single was never released, although its first appearance as lead track on Promo 500 no doubt made it a likely contender. The track is credited as coming from the VPRO transmission. Smokin' Japanese Babe. Smokin' Japanese Babe is the jazziest sounding track on ISDN, and at least partially where the album's association with that style comes from. Opening with a brief tense environment with electronic burps over a sustained chord, the track begins with a bass loop from Raga Velascani Todi by John Williams, a piece that would go on to feature on a number of Monster Psychedelic Bubble mixes years later, and one that also features in sister track Are They Fighting Us? Removed from the raga-like piece and looped, it becomes a steady groove, behind which a rolling trip-hop beat comes in. An accordion sample adds to the laid-back vibe as waves continue to wash in and out. Regular breaks into a muted trumpet melody add to the jazzy feel. It still retains an element of the album's overall creepy vibe, especially in some of the odd background samples, but in general it's a very chilled track, the closest to what might be considered stoner music that the band ever came. There are no overt Eastern tones, but the title adds to the slightly sleazy vibe. A burbling synth loop forms a suitably trippy closing environment. While the main track remains the same, there are subtle differences to the intro and outro environments on the track's various releases. The version on the Ramblings of a Madman 12-inch includes an extended outro that morphs into a drone, as well as featuring an apostrophe in the track title, and the black version of ISDN is indexed on the CD to include an extra 9 seconds of the opening environment. It's one of the few tracks not given a transmission date in the ISDN liner notes. The first known broadcast was the VPRO show. You're Creeping Me Out. Arguably the most Lifeforms-like track on ISDN, You're Creeping Me Out is a bright piece of bubbly electronica, complete with a reasonably fast tempo, electronic bleeps and buzzes, and even whale samples. After a largely raw, percussive and somewhat claustrophobic run of tracks, it opens the album up somewhat and begins a run of slightly more ambient pieces. It differs from Lifeforms a little in terms of the amount of samples used. Long sections of the track are devoted to the band's usual range of unidentified sounds, spewed out through delay boxes and layered over a stuttered beat. Between these parts comes a wistful organ melody. The title is another bit of self-deprecation from within the walls of Earthbeat, a side effect of two guys spending too much time locked in a room together. The ISDN liner notes credit the track as coming from the VPRO broadcast. With very little in the way of intro or outro environments, the Seeing Free version on Promo 500 barely differs from the album mix. Eyes pop, skin explodes, everybody dead. The somewhat violent title of this track, paraphrased from a Repo Man sample used during the 1994 Kiss FM transmission, doesn't particularly reflect the feel of the track. Opening with a dense environment with electronic whooshes, whale song and galloping horses, the mood changes drastically with the melancholic harpsichord piece that follows in what is by far the most melodic section on ISDN in general. The gorgeous melody is somewhat offset by the almost comedy horror film harpsichord, but it manages to stay on the right side of silly. Gurgling synths and bubbles of sound are employed in usual FSOL fashion, leading to a track that's both playful and sad at the same time, while managing to fit in with the dense production of the album. After less than 2 minutes, the track comes to an abrupt halt, making way for a mournful Uilleann pipe sample. I absolutely love this moment. The heavy reverb and layers of chaotic sound swirling around the pipes give it a really heartbreaking feel, something not often found in the FSOL catalogue. A wonderful end to a wonderful and very weird track. ISDN credits the track to the New York transmission, however the only known broadcast comes from the same Kiss FM show as the titular sample mentioned at the start. It's my mind that works. If the band's earlier ambient material was only a shade more unusual than your average 90s ambient fare, then by ISDN they had moved into far, far weirder territories. From the first play of ISDN I always found this track totally baffling, and to this day it's really hard to put it into words. Airy drones run through the whole track, creating a sense of dread, compounded by a heartbeat-like kick drum, repeated alarm-like beeps and whooshes reprised from Just a Fucking Idiot, and a tense, unresolved piano melody. When used during a more rhythmic track, the band's range of bizarre samples often become part of the percussive texture, but on a track like this they really stand out on their own, the strangeness of many of them becoming really obvious. At the halfway mark, the track sounds about ready to take off, and pummeling tribal drums make an appearance before being pushed away by the growling of machinery. A night stood in an unfamiliar, unwelcoming landscape, the pulses and beeps of a life support machine, an oncoming attack of an unknowable enemy. These are all images created in my mind by this track. The only downside is how much is cut away. In the liner notes for the black version of ISDN, the track is credited as coming from the New York transmission, on which this edit is performed. Broadcast 2 months earlier, however, the VPRO transmission includes an 8-minute version of the track, and it's the kind of thing where you almost forget to breathe because of how intense and captivating the moment is. The white version of ISDN suggests the track comes from that transmission, but sadly remains as the 3-minute edit. It makes the Podroom release of the VPRO show worth purchasing alone. The title and opening spoken samples, you know the way everybody's into weirdness right now and it's all part of a cosmic unconsciousness, come from Repo Man, a clear favourite of the band's in late 94, used regularly throughout the transmissions of the time. Dirty Shadows. One of the oldest tracks on ISDN, Dirty Shadows dates back to the Lifeform sessions, and its epic melodic feel ties it in with that album to an extent. The use of acoustic drum loops, however, makes it feel like a halfway between the two albums, and maybe why it was initially rejected. The first known broadcast of the track dates to 93 on the 4th Kiss FM transmission, with the opening environment being first heard 2 weeks later on the final Kiss FM show. The opening environment continues the creepy vibe of the album with organic gurglings, disembodied voices and electric guitar feedback. A thoroughly sinister spoken excerpt from Exorcist II The Heretic closes the environment. This moment is referenced in the white ISDN CD's liner notes. Out of a reverb, come fly the teeth of the wind into this lonely landscape of our own creation, unsignposted, trying to keep the ability to objectively feel if this is working. A hi-hat rhythm and combined acoustic and synth bass loop accompany evocative spooky synth chords, leading to lonely piano melodies. It always makes me think of making an epic journey through an alien landscape, the occasional whistling melody acting as a signpost, the swelling chords describing the vastness of the vista up ahead. As ethereal and otherworldly a piece as the band have ever recorded. Echoing the slap bass outro of the live versions, the group instead cleverly tie in the plucked string sample from Tired over the breakbeat-led outro, leading brilliantly into that track. According to the liner notes, the album version of Dirty Shadows comes from the Essential Mix show of May 94, albeit with all of Robert Fripp's guitar removed. These might be the source of the guitar textures sourced from Robert Fripp live with Ethos, Radio 1 FM, 14th of the 5th 94 credit listed in both versions of ISDN, but assigned to no particular track. Tired. Tired is less of a track and more a collection of sketches and environments, make it one of the most strangely structured pieces in the group's vast history. Some parts of it date back to the Lifeform sessions. The section with synth pads and industrial sounding beats, starting around 25 seconds, first appear on the Kiss FM transmission number 4, with the flute section that follows later ending up as the outro of Little Brother. The sequence White Noise that forms Tired's outro also dates to the 4th Kiss FM show. The middle section with horses and creepy humming was first broadcast on the VPRO transmission, as well as being included on Live in New York from the New York transmission. The opening and closing rattling sections come from part of an otherwise unreleased track broadcast to Kiss FM in late '94, a show which also features the melodic climax accompanied by frogs. Ironically, the only transmission not to include a standalone section of Tired is the New York transmission, the one the track is listed as being taken from in ISDN's liner notes. Of course, the horse section overlaps both Tired and Live in New York, so the credit is just about valid. Tonally, it's pretty varied, the early beats section being bright and rhythmic, the mid-section with horses and disembodied voices very sinister, the synth climax beautiful and bittersweet. It just about manages to work though, giving an impression of the more abstract parts of the band's live performances and hinting at what environments would have sounded like. Egypt. For a long time I thought the opening whisper of Any Time, taken from the film Predator, was Enter. Combined with the title, I assumed it was somebody suggesting entering a pyramid. Tonally, Egypt picks up where Dirty Shadows left off, subtle but vast synth chords and chirping crickets suggesting a night spent in some vast landscape. The main focus is given to an Eastern-sounding female vocal and a flute sample, adding to the track's exoticism and not making it too dissimilar to something from Lifeforms. The rhythm track comes in the form of one of the group's strangest, with an oddly tuned metallic sample alongside a Roland drum machine clap, staggering the beat and giving it a clockwork mechanical feel. Things break down to near silence with just the nighttime insect sample present, adding a real sense of space on a frequently claustrophobic sounding album. The track ends with metallic percussion going wild, pitch shifting crazily and faded away. This is the point at which the two versions of ISDN diverge, with the white edition fading the track out far sooner before things get too crazy. Both versions of ISDN suggest the track comes from the VPRO transmission. Its only known broadcast, however, is on the Kiss FM show. Are they fighting us? While ISDN doesn't come close to Lifeforms in its use of recurring themes and samples, there are linked tracks on it. Perhaps the most obvious are Smokin' Japanese Babe and Are They Fighting Us, two tracks that sample the same John Williams bass loop from Raga Vilasakani Toady, but the same wave samples, rising and descending synth notes, tambourine shakes and bleep sounds are also there. If Smokin' Japanese Babe had been released as a multi-part single, Are They Fighting Us could easily have been one of the additional paths. It's one of the few brighter tracks on ISDN, opening with a brief environment carried over from Egypt, including a voice saying Thinking, which had previously appeared on transmissions, before a major chord, bouncy bass line and flute sample all come in. A slow beat accompanies and the track generally plays out in a warm, relaxing vibe. Halfway through, however, a second, more glitchy electronic beat comes in, one that also appears in an unreleased track broadcast on the VPRO transmission. The pace continues with the arrival of a totally new breakbeat, and then it's back to the first section to close. In an oddly backwards-looking moment, the track ends on a brief Lifeforms sample. The warmer tones of the piece act as one of the few much-needed breaks from the bleakness of ISDN. The confrontational title, taken from a Bill Hicks routine used in late '94 transmissions, as well as on the end of Z-Box, feels somewhat at odds with the overall vibe of the track. No transmission date is given in the liner notes. The first known broadcast is the aforementioned VPRO broadcast. Are They Fighting Us appears on all black editions of ISDN, but for timing purposes only the vinyl press of the white edition. Hot Knives. A brief string and guitar environment opens what is possibly the most bizarre track from the band's entire Virgin run. Hot Knives is a song, complete with original lyrics and vocals sung by Garry. Take me, feel me, hold me tonight, feel me, love me, take me home is not the kind of lyric you'd imagine existing on an ever so old track, but Garry sings it through a vocoder. Just as strange, the track is effectively a very drastic reworking of the 1990 Mental Cube piece Child of the Bass Generation, utilising the same breakbeat, albeit much slower, organ and flute samples. The standard female vocal sample is in place, as well as the now familiar muted trumpet adding to the jazzy vibe. The outer environment incorporates guitar textures, possibly frippatronics from the Essential Mix show, and a brief snippet of Stomach Acid, another link to a once potential environments tracklist. This environment runs for over a minute, making the main track barely 2 minutes long. No matter which way you look at it, Hot Knives is a very, very strange track, and one that doesn't really fit in anywhere, even on a strange album like ISDN. The title, referring to a manner of smoking cannabis by heating it between two hot knives, is amusingly at odds with Garry's statement from around the same time that,
No, because I don't take drugs, so I write my music in completely the opposite state. Like a horrible sanity, I would describe it as. Too sane. Acutely aware of my surroundings. That's how I write music. And I guess that's what our music's about, you know, it's not about tripping out and, you know, escaping.
The liner notes have the track listed as coming from the VPRO transmission, one of numerous errors in this regard. The only known broadcast of the track is on the Kiss FM 94 show. One of 2 tracks from the Black ISDN album not to make it to any format of the white edition, it eventually found a home on the digital-only Teachings from the Electronic Brain Rare Tracks Edition EP, and was eventually restored to ISDN on the 30th Anniversary Deluxe Edition. A Study of 6 Guitars, also known as A Study of 6 Guitars by Amorphous Androgynous. Shortly after the release of Lifeforms, with its promise of a new Amorphous Androgynous album called Environments, a Virgin compilation entitled A Brief History of Ambient Volume 3, The Music of Changes, came out, including a track promising to be from that very album. Of course that never happened, and A Study of 6 Guitars eventually found a home on ISDN. The album's final ambient track, the title is somewhat self-explanatory, with 6 distinct guitar samples used throughout. These include acoustic loops, a chunky bass riff, a single chiming note, and a brief soaring melody. One of a handful of tracks on ISDN to break away from the album's darker feel, it's quite a glorious, uplifting little piece of music. As with most FSOL ambient, there are still some rhythmic elements, albeit in the usual manner with strange percussive samples used in place of recognisable instrumentation. The closing environment dips back into darkness once again with descending synth lines and nighttime birds, although intriguingly dates back to the Lifeform sessions first being broadcast on the 4th Kiss FM transmission. This environment is truncated slightly on the white edition of ISDN. The track itself is incorrectly listed as coming from the Radio 1 transmission, the only known broadcast is on the VPRO show. An end of sorts. The Black edition of ISDN ends with the strongest album closer of the Virgin era, the epic, soaring An End of Sorts. The track itself is in fact a reworking of Cascade Part 5, released the previous year. The main breakbeat, as well as the vast synth melody, originate in that version of Cascade. The rest of the track rewrites the piece as a rawer, more minimal number, removing the synth sequences, Eastern instrumentation and drum machines, and focusing more on drum loops. This less overtly electronic sounding piece feels more at home on ISDN, but its minimal nature makes it a breezy closer, acting as a breath of fresh air after the album's denser feel. The kind of track that might feel underwhelming mid-album but works perfectly here at the end. A brief snippet of jazz acts as a bizarre outer environment, which can be heard in extended form on the VPRO transmission. As with the previous track, the album's liner notes state that An End of Sorts originates on the Essential Mix broadcast, despite it not being present on that show. The only known broadcast is on the Kiss FM 94 transmission. This is the other of the 2 tracks from the Black ISDN not to make it to any format of the White edition, eventually reissued on Teachings from the Electronic Brain Rare Tracks edition and the 30th Anniversary Expanded ISDN. And that's your lot for ISDN and for today. I hope you enjoyed this video. Do let me know down below what you think of this album. It's an unusual album even by FSOL standards, so yeah, I'd love to hear your thoughts, and there are share, like and subscribe buttons you might also like to press. I'll be back very soon, tying up the remaining aspects of the ISDN era with the Far Out Son of Lung single, the Essential Mix 95 and the white reissue of ISDN. I hope you'll join me for that.